Welcome to With a Gay Twist. We are a bi-weekly podcast hosted by two homosexuals who talk about news, politics, and pop culture, but with a gay twist. I'm Mason, and girl, I am so excited I could just spit.
And I'm Zach. Molly, honey, you in danger, girl.
Yes, we is. Now, later on today's podcast, we'll be joined by our very extra special guest, Samantha Shay, to talk about the current happenings between the US, Russia, Ukraine, NATO, and the European Union.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. So get something good to drink, sit back, relax, and get ready, because we get into it.
We do. Mama.
Now, Samantha Shay was a captain in the United States Air Force. Samantha was born in the former Soviet Union and immigrated in 1992 with her family at the age of 4. So we are extremely lucky to have Samantha on the podcast with us today to talk about the Russia, US, Ukraine situation that's going on. She's going to really understand it from an insider's perspective and from military's perspective. And then a little later on, we'll be learning about our queer person in history. And Zach, who will you be telling us about today?
Today, we're going to learn about Admiral Rachel Levine. Oh, that's right. An admiral.
I feel like saying Captain my Captain.
Admiral my Admiral.
Admiral my Admiral. Well, that is sure to be fascinating, and I can't wait for what's new with Samantha and with our queer person in history.
It's going to be good.
But first, Zach, you looking? It's the segment where we discuss what we've been looking at from television, film, and other media. So, Zach, what have you been looking at recently?
Girl, I gotta tell you, I recently watched something that you mentioned a couple weeks ago. We were talking about, I don't know, probably some gay shit. And
Always.
And you mentioned something about Cabaret.
Life is a cabaret, old chum.
And I was like, oh yeah, I've never seen that. And in that moment,
You lost your gay card.
You threatened to take away my gay card. You threatened to end our friendship and to end the podcast. And so I was like, shit. Okay, so I guess I better go watch it. And luckily it's on HBO Max. So I watched Cabaret.
And tell me all the things. Did you love it? Did you love Liza with a Z?
I hated it.
Girl, no.
I hated it.
Girl, no.
I hated it. I did not like this movie at all.
Cover your ears, children. Cover your ears.
Okay, so let me
It
tell
ain't
you.
so, mama.
Okay, so first of all, Liza with a Z. I mean,
Jazz
Liza. I mean, of course, Liza is Liza. I mean, as a gay man, I'm contractually obligated to adore, love, and worship all things that are Liza.
Yes.
And while it's
this was like top billing Liza too. This was her in her prime.
Yeah. Oh yeah, this is Liza in her prime. This is peak Liza, but I did not enjoy this Liza. This character of Sally Bowles. The hair, loved it. Loved the hair. Loved the fact that it was sometimes like a little swoop to the side. Sometimes it was more messy. Sometimes it was straight down, showing the widow's peak. Loved the haircut. Not wild about the characterization. Not wild about this person. At first, she seems very sort of charming and aloof and boho chic. And, you know, she's like, darling, do you have a cigarette, darling? Oh, divine. And you're like, oh my God, she's sort of cool. I sort of like her. And then you realize that every new person she meets, she says the exact same thing. And it's like, is that just like how she likes to say hello? Or is she a psychopath? And this is like her way of manipulating people? Like, what is happening? So I didn't really like that. The story of her. Also, I did not realize Michael York was in this movie.
Yes. Oh my gosh, he's so handsome in this movie.
He's so handsome. He is just a twink from heaven in this movie. Those steely blue eyes.
Delicious.
He is very good looking in this film. Also, love the German guy, the Baron that they sort of have a fling with.
Maximilian. Yes.
Maximilian, yes, Maximilian. Also very good looking. But here's what I didn't like about Michael York's character.
Bisexual.
Well, he comes. So this is an interesting thing. He comes in. Spoilers. I mean, if there could be spoilers for a movie that was made in 1970, whatever. He comes in. Michael York's character comes in. He introduces himself, and he basically says, "I'm gay." He doesn't use those words, but that's what he says. And that he had tried to have sex with women 3 times before, and
Nothing rose to the occasion.
It just didn't work. And so he prefers men. And then Liza sort of backs off from sort of, climbing onto his dick, and sort of backs off and says, "Okay, cool, we'll be friends." And then like 2.5 seconds later, they're making out and they're having sex, and then he's like, "Well, I guess I just hadn't met the right girl." And that whole shtick of like gay people, like, "Well, you're not really gay, you just haven't met the right girl yet." I was like, I mean, first of all, this is the 70s, so that is very of the time, but
Yes.
I'm not a fan of that. Kudos for him later actually having a gay relationship with Maximilian. That's great. I'm glad that they were able to do that.
Well, so the funny thing is, though, I'm going to correct you on one thing, though.
Correct.
Is that when he's talking with Sally about, "I've only ever attempted to be with 3 women," and I forget the exact phrase, but basically he couldn't get hard, right? So nothing happened. He never then says that he sleeps with men, because Sally's character jumps right into, "Oh, well, I didn't know, honey. Why didn't you just tell me? Da, 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 da." But he never says that he's intimate. It's just, "I've tried to have sex with a woman, and that was it. It didn't happen." Boom, right? It's inferred that he likes men, especially when he meets his 2T turned friend later on, when he is tutoring him in English. And then later on we get the oh gosh, what was her name? The well-to-do
Jewish woman
lady comes in, and then that whole romance thing goes on. But yeah, Michael York's character never actually confirms, nor do we see any hint of it until Maximilian comes in.
Well, other than the fact that he's a walking twink.
Well, other than he's a walk-in twink, yeah.
But I tell you what, though, there are 2 things that really shocked me that I was like, "Oh my god, that's in this movie." One is Joel Grey's performance, which is one of the worst things ever committed to film. I am so sorry. I know he won an Academy Award for this, as did Liza, but I did not get the Master of Ceremonies. I thought it was the weirdest fucking thing I have ever seen, and it, art is subjective, and I'm obviously some people enjoyed it. He won an Academy Award, but I watched
Fosse.
it and went, that is the weirdest fucking shit ever. His voice, I did not enjoy the voice. Oh no, I love me some Fosse now. Fosse. Martha Graham. Like, yes, all that. Twyla. Michael Kidd. Yes, love them all. But I did not enjoy the auditory input I was receiving from the Master of Ceremonies. No offense to Joel Grey, who is lovely and wonderful, and no offense to his daughter, Jennifer Grey, from Dirty Dancing.
Yes.
But I didn't enjoy that. The other thing, I was like, wait a minute, this movie's about Nazis?
Oh my gosh. Yes, it is all social commentary about the inability of German society and society at large, the international society, to take the rise of Nazis seriously, and how they missed ample opportunities left, right, center, up, down, sideways. Anytime they turned around, basically, stepped out of the shower and looked 2 feet in front of their face to squash the shit out of the Nazis coming into power the way that they did. So we see it a number of times. So the first time that we see the Nazi is in the club. It's kind of an off-camera moment for a hot second. The camera kind of pans over and then goes right back to whatever Sally was doing at that moment. I think Michael York's character, this was the first time that he came into the club. So we see a little scuffle with some of the well-to-do uppities with this kid in the Nazi garb. The Nazi just... their brown getup. It wasn't like their true
the brown
army
shirts.
Regalia, but it was like their day wear, if you will.
It was day drag.
It was day drag. So he gets kicked out of the club, and we're kind of like, oh, okay, you as an audience member are supposed to be applauding and yes, get it. Not 5 minutes later in the film, we see the same guy that had been yelling at this Nazi getting the crap kicked out of him. He literally gets beaten to death in the alley outside the club by the same Nazi and his friends. So it's interesting to hear you talk about Sally's character. Interesting to hear you talk about the character of the Master of Ceremonies, because they are direct, and Maximilian actually, they are direct reflections of different parts of society and different parts of the mentality that the society in that area of the world was taking at the moment. So you have Maximilian, who represents the bourgeoisie, right? Those that had money, those that couldn't be bothered, those that just kind of looked down their nose at the Nazis, saying, meh, they're just noise, we'll be able to control them, no problem. He also represents what the US was thinking at that time. What Britain was thinking at that time, because he himself is not German. Then you have Sally, who is, as you said, this aloof, this frivolous, this person that's caught up in the moment, someone that really exemplifies what Moulin Rouge talked about. As far as just kind of living in the moment, living for love, living for the day to day, not looking and worrying about the future, right?
We're creatures of the underworld. We can't afford to fall in love.
Exactly. And then you have Masters of Ceremony, who is the clown of the movie. And he's the one that's redirecting. He's the one that is really driving home how society is to look at what's happening. So first, we have the introduction of, his whole number of welcome, bienvenue, welcome, right? So that's just, this is what we are in Germany. This is what we are in Berlin. His next number that he has is making fun of Nazis. So this is how society at large is shifting. So first, it's not even on the map. Then, oh, there's something to laugh about. Then one of the last numbers that we see him do is with the gorilla. And the last line of that number is, and you wouldn't even know that she's Jewish. Turning the Jew into the joke of society. So adopting Nazism. So it's a deeper movie than most of the people that I know actually realize. Like, it's not this frivolous gay number, even though they hide it, but they have all these inserts of the political commentary and like what's happening in the world versus the dichotomy of people living their life and not giving a shit about other humans.
Okay, so the next time I'm going to watch this movie, I'm just going to have you over. You're going to sit on the couch with me. And we're just going to watch it and keep hitting pause. And you're going to explain these things to me like you just did.
As they're happening.
As they're happening. Okay. I would like an easel with charts and graphs.
Oh, I'll bring a dry erase board. with multiple colored markers. Like, I'll go full school teacher on you.
If you were even considering bringing only black dry erase markers, I would have judged you.
No, I have neon.
We're gay, honey.
We're gay.
Well, that's what I've been watching this week.
I can't believe you didn't enjoy it, and I apologize that your first viewing was pretty much how it was received.
Well, I might give it a second chance later, and with new lenses.
Yeah, I think that it is an acquired taste, definitely. I think if you're not someone that's just going to fall in love with the fact that Liza is on the screen, like if you can get over that fact, and you kind of get past the Brazil-esque absurdity that's happening on stage with Master of Ceremonies, because Brazil, the movie, people, not the country, Brazil, I definitely compare the absurdity and obscurity of that film with what they did with the Master of Ceremonies, Joel Grey's character. If you can get past those two things, it's just a phenomenal social commentary of the time. And it was made during a time when the wounds of World War II were still very, very fresh for everybody.
Okay, then.
So, well, I guess with that, talking about Nazis and talking about war, let's go ahead and move on to our segment of What's New? It's a segment where we talk about the news that caught our eye this week. And this week, we're joined by our special guest, Samantha Shay. Let's talk a little bit more about Samantha before we bring her on. Samantha graduated from Rutgers University in 2011 with a bachelor's in physics and joined the Air Force in 2013, commissioning as an officer from Officers Training School. So that means that she went to this training school. The way that this operates is when you enlist, you go a couple different paths. So Samantha chose to go through the officer training school, which means that you are basically guaranteed a ranking officer's position when you graduate. So came out, was a commissioned officer in the Air Force in 2013. She completed her undergraduate space training in 2015. And that's right, folks, you heard it. Space training. Okay, where she earned her space wings and was assigned to the 4th Space Operations Squadron in Colorado Springs, where she flew satellites. So she was remotely piloting satellites for us. Okay. Later, she served as her squadron's chief of mission, planning against all ground-based and space-based threats to her unit's 20-something satellites in geosync orbit that provided 2/3 of all military satellite communications to forces worldwide.
She is basically Will Smith in Independence Day mixed with Jeff Goldblum in Independence Day.
Or if you've ever seen or read the book Ender's Game, she's basically Ender.
And she's Ender.
She is Ender. Okay. So in total, Samantha served 7 years on active duty. And here we go, folks. This is how it ties in. Not only is Samantha a Russian American, right? So we have that piece. She was in the military, so we have that piece. But she was also the first, the only, the highest ranking openly serving transgender space operations officer.
Historic.
And I can't wait to hear what she has to say today.
Yas, queen.
So thank you for joining us this week, Samantha.
Hello.
So excited that you're here.
So glad you could be here.
It's a pleasure.
Before we get into the news stories of the week surrounding Russia, Ukraine, and the talks that are happening over in Europe, recently in Geneva, finishing up on Wednesday, let's go ahead and do our crash course. Well, this week's crash course, we're going to dive into the complicated history of Russia because, girl, it is sorted.
It is more complicated than the rules of All Stars.
It's a lot. Okay, so I had to do some research this week to kind of get down into the details. Just call me Finnick O'Dare, coming to you from District 12 on a bed of white roses, giving you all the hot tea on the capital that is Russia. So really, we think that's important that we kind of set the stage and we talk about what Russia was and how it became what it is today real quick, because there's some things that Putin's doing and some goals that he has that are reflecting and kind of the callbacks of bringing the Russia of the late 19th century, early 20th century kind of back into today. So to start off with, Russia was one of the last groups of people that was ruled underneath a serfdom, underneath a monarchy. So for those of us that don't remember, serfdom kind of died out in Europe in the Middle Ages. Okay, so this was an idea of a caste system where you had peasants that were serving local land-owning individuals that were representatives of the monarchy. So a lot of us can think back to any period film. The one that pops into my mind is with Heath Ledger, and we're looking at Knight's Tale. Kind of that time period, right? Well, Russia didn't get rid of serfdom until 1861, which is several hundred years later in history.
They were a little late to the game.
A little late to the game, which kind of plays into this idea that Russia has now of kind of getting up off their knees. This idea of everyone's out to get us. Everyone's kind of against us because the world kind of left them behind in the industrialization age. When the rest of Europe and the US were going through our age of industrialization, Russia was just coming up out of peasantdom, basically. So from 1861 into the early 20th century, so 1905 into the 1910s, Russia had a number of uprisings that were really focused on these social uprisings from workers against the ruling monarchy as it became and grew into its own industrial age. So they were about 56 years kind of behind everyone else within the Western world, right? Two uprisings that were really paramount for them was the Bloody Sunday Massacre of 1905, which was unarmed protesters that were killed or wounded by the Tsar's troops. So we know of monarchies typically as kings and queens. So you think of the kings and queens in Great Britain, or you think of the monarchy that was in Spain, France, but in Russia they called them czars. So the Tsar basically sent troops out because there was these large protests of organized workers that were revolting against the conditions that they were working under, and just decimated them, which kind of set the stage for the issues that would come up later on in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, where it was really giving power back to the people and taking it away from the monarchy. Kind of them understanding and realizing their power in numbers and that they were really the backbone of the country.
The thing that I think a lot of right-wingers probably hope and wish were happening in America today.
It's really scary how much of this history kind of mirrors what is going on in our own country today. And it's really scary to see the parallels between what Russia is doing now, specifically with the youth armies over the last 10 years, and what Hitler and the Nazi Party did in Austria and Germany coming up through the 30s prior to World War II, how they developed that.
See, it's important to know your history, people.
Really important to know the history. So between 1905, though, with the Bloody Sunday Massacre, and the Bolsheviks' Revolution of 1917, we had World War One, and World War One was really pivotal in Russian history because they took severe, heavy losses at the end of this war. So not only did they take heavy losses during the war, as far as what was left of just their citizenship, what was left of their economy, what was left of just the kind of view of their political power, but they also lost 30% of their geographic holdings. So 30% of their territory was lost at the end of this war in the 1918 Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Probably not saying that correctly. But basically that was the treaty that ended World War One. And they had to give, and this is really crucial, they had to give most of their land to Germany. So they lost Finland, Russian Poland, Estonia, Livonia, part of Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, important to remember Ukraine, and also Bessarabia. Okay, so all these different areas they lost. So again, kind of just echoing that idea of the world is against us. They're taking things from us. They're just waiting to pounce on us. We have to build up our strength. We have to be ready to defend ourselves, right? Fast forward to World War II. This is after Stalin has come into power in 1922. This is after communism has taken hold following the Russian Civil War, which was pretty much right after the end of World War One. They kind of really coincided because World War One ended in 1918. The Russian Civil War is actually said to have began in 1917. So they kind of went from one war to another. It's just a external war in World War One, so fighting other countries, to an internalized war with their Russian Civil War that lasted until 1924.
That's a long time.
Which is crazy. Talk about, we say the 7-year war was really long. That was nothing compared to what they had to go through. So World War II comes and goes. Russia is the victor on the Eastern Front of the war. They pushed back Germany because Hitler was an idiot and attacked right as winter was hitting. Didn't have troops to be able to sustain that push, and Russia came out victorious. World War II was not ended by any formalized agreement. So there was no treaty that was signed, but they gained almost everything that they had lost back, except for the southern part of Russia, which they had previously given to the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. So if we think about this really quick before we dive into Putin, Russia has this kind of back and forth of losing land, getting land, losing land, giving land. And that kind of goes along with how their economy developed during those times. So you would have these periods of economic growth where they didn't lose land before war. Then during war and post-war for World War I and the Civil War and the Bolshevik Revolution, their economy plummets. Enter in 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Okay, so Russia, Soviet Russia under imperial rule ended in 1922. 1924 saw the establishment of the USSR, which was basically a group of Soviet nations coming together for a common cause. So these were areas such as Ukraine, once they were brought in 1917, actually Christmas of 1917, Ukraine was established as the Soviet Ukrainian Republic. You had Bulgaria, you had a couple other nations. By the end of the USSR, it actually comprised of 15 different countries that we know today. But it dissolved due to political and economic issues in 1991. So it only lasted less than, 70 years, right? So 91.
Not a bad run, I guess. I don't know. Maybe. I guess it depends on if you're comparing it to, 250 years of American democracy. Well, at least for now, it's an American democracy.
Right, exactly. So it's just kind of an illustration of how tumultuous the Russian history is as far as the development and the consolidation of power. So underneath the Soviet Russia, USSR, communism ruled. That's where it was. You had this centralized government that would take these large issues, but each of these other entities, these republics that had signed on, you had one, two, three, four, five. You had 6 different types of Soviet republics, which is where I got really confused. You had outblasts, you have republics, you had krays, you have autonomous okrugs, federal cities, and then we had one autonomous outblast, which was a Jewish outblast, which wasn't established until after World War II. So basically all the Jews in Russia kind of went, we're safe over here. So yeah, it's just,
So this is what's interesting to me is that Russia began as Soviet Russia. It then became the USSR. And then it turned back into Russia again.
It turned back into Russia again in 1991. Right.
So I guess my question would be, are the Soviet Russia of yesteryear and Russia today, are they essentially the same? Did we just do a hard reboot there?
Well, let's ask our guest.
Hi, Samantha.
Hi, Samantha.
Hey, what's up?
So yeah, the difference between like old imperial Soviet Russia and then Russia today, what kind of similarities or differences are we looking at here?
Sure. So I'm just going to correct you real quick, Zach. So you said Soviet Imperial Russia, and you're conflating 2 different Russias. So Imperial Russia lasted basically from, I'm going to butcher the date, but it's something like 800 AD is when most Russian historians believe Russia to have come into place. And that's basically when Russia adopted Christianity, Eastern Orthodox Christianity, as their main religion, which is when like the birth of the Russian Empire kind of began. And it wasn't even an empire back then, it was just a country. And that lasted up until when Mason said the Russian Revolution happened, the Communist Revolution in 1917. And then you had start Soviet Union till 1991. So now Russia is a federation. It's a country with a democratically elected leader, but they've only had 3 different people be president since 1991. So now they have the same strongman mentality, which is what Russia's always known. They have a strongman leader, who today is Vladimir Putin. So in that way, it hasn't changed much, but it's still different because where he derives his legitimacy from isn't from a communist ideology, and it's not from, God-given birthright to rule as king and emperor. He gets his legitimacy from having been elected officially by the Russian people. So that's kind of the difference, but in a lot of ways it's still very similar that you have a strong man at the top that's kind of ruling over this giant swath of land and millions of people. Hopefully that answered your question on that one.
Yes, and thank you for the correction. Would you say that, I would say that as an American watching from afar, that these democratic elections happening in Russia seem almost just as, they're just pro forma. That there's not actually a voice of the people. It's just sort of like, yeah, we're just going to have to keep Putin, whether because the people genuinely want him or because he just wants to stay in power and things just sort of happen to make him stay in power. Those elections don't necessarily seem as democratic as they do in other democracies.
Yeah.
So is that just my...
No, you're absolutely right.
Okay.
No, you kind of nailed it.
Yeah, there was something about the recent election. I remember there being some sort of talk about how it really was just a term of Democratic vote. Like it really was just a face for what actually happened. There was some sort of hubbub of he was supposed to not be president for his 4th 6-year term, but then he kind of threw some rule out or did some sort of change that allowed him to be elected again because he was originally supposed to step back and name a successor.
Yeah, so what had happened was, per the Russian constitution, a president can only serve 2 4-year terms. So Putin was elected in 2000 and served until 2008, and he basically swapped places with his deputy, Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev, sorry, I'm the Russian expert here, and I'm the one butchering Russian names. So Dima took over for 4 years, and then he stepped aside. And at the next presidential election in 2012, Putin ran again for 2 more terms. But during that, after he was reelected, the Russian legislature, the Duma, actually changed the constitution to allow Putin basically to run for unlimited terms. So he didn't have to do that faux swap with his deputy anymore at the end of 2020. He could just continue going and running for re-election until he decides he doesn't want to be president anymore, if that makes sense.
So he was allowed to essentially become president for life because the Duma allowed him to be so, which makes me wonder, well,
Yes.
the Duma is supposed to be, I mean, here in the United States, we have 3 branches of government which serve as checks and balances to preserve separation of powers. But and this makes me wonder if there's the same sort of separation of powers and checks and balances with the Duma and the presidency there, or does the Duma just sort of do whatever he wants? Does the Duma do whatever
Yeah, the
Putin
latter.
wants?
Yeah.
Oh.
So that's what it comes down to. So there is a separation of powers. Like Russia has a judiciary, just like the United States does. They have a legislature, just like the U.S. does, called the Duma, and then they have the presidency. So they have 3 branches of government, but the problem is there's no viable opposition party. And I kind of wanted to answer your earlier question with that. Like, yeah, it's democracy in name only, because there is no true opposition to Vladimir Putin's ruling party and Vladimir Putin, period. So there's no opposition party to even run against him. But then separately, because he's in power, he's basically been able to he's stuffed the Duma with his puppets. I mean, maybe that's not the politically correct term, but basically his minions and minions of his party into the legislature, and then same thing in the judiciary. So there's no actual check and balance system on Vladimir Putin's presidency or his political power within the country.
Yeah, and I think that that's an interesting point to make, is kind of how he came into power, because during my research, I found out that it was the previous president, on December 31st, 1999, Russian President Boris Yeltsin had actually just suddenly resigned and named Putin his successor. And before being named the successor and basically the new president of Russia, Putin came from the KGB. And once
That's
he
correct.
came up into the presidency, what he did was really, really intelligent. And it's exactly the same thing that Hitler did when he came into power, is that he started to name all of the service officers that he had worked with or knew into these high-ranking positions all over the Russian power structure. So he basically seeded his support in every level of government. So when these issues with the Duma came up, it was a non-issue.
There's no
Anything
resistance.
that he wanted to do, there was no resistance. It's very similar to what's happening in Florida with DeSantis and a fully Republican-backed legislature and judiciary in the state. DeSantis gets to do whatever he wants because there's no opposition within the checks and balance systems that were established. It's the same thing in Russia with Putin, because he went in and built the scaffolding that he needed for that support.
That's scary shit.
You're 100% right, Mason. That's a really good analysis of what Putin did to kind of consolidate his power base in government.
It's insane. So at this point, what would we think Putin's goal is? Like, what was his end goal? What does he want to get out of these talks? Or really just kind of what he wants to see Russia in the next, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 lifetime years that he has?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer that question. Zach wanted to say something, I think. Zach, do you have a question too?
That was exactly what I was going to say. It's like, okay, so there's all this posturing, there's all of these, the powers that be moving the chess pieces on the board to be just in such a way. This is building up to something. So yeah, like so what is this? What's this thing that's happening next? What's the long term here?
Sure. So one thing that wasn't mentioned in the whole history of Russia was the Ukraine actually used to be the capital of Russia. Kiev, I want to say it was Kiev, was actually the first capital of the Russian Empire. In fact, I want to say the summer palace for the ruling monarchs was actually there. I should say it was the Winter Palace. The one that they went to in the winter was in the Ukraine, and they stayed in St. Petersburg, whereas the Winter Palace, I believe. Sorry, I'm swapping which one is which. But historically, Kiev, which is the capital of the Ukraine, was a capital of Russia. So the difference, the saying like, oh, Ukraine's kind of an independent country, it's only been an independent country for 30 years. A lot of people in Russia, historians and your average general public, kind of view the Ukraine as like a sister nation to Russia. They don't see them as having been different or differing countries or having different histories to warrant them having their own independence. So Putin is playing on that, on kind of those historical feelings, to try to bring Ukraine back into the Russian sphere of influence and put it under Russia's umbrella, kind of unify those two countries. Not just the way that the Soviet Union did, where they had the 15 Soviet republics, like with Tajikistan and Kazakhstan, were countries that had totally different ethnicities and different language groups and different peoples were brought into the Soviet Union. He sees the Ukraine as like, oh, that's also Russia. There should be no difference between the Ukraine and Russia. They're the same thing. You could also say the same thing with Belarus. He's had a lot more success keeping Belarus within the Russian sphere of influence, but Ukraine's been pushing over the last 30 years for more autonomy and independence. They want to go the way of the rest of Europe. They want to join the European Union. They want to have a stronger currency. They want the euro to stabilize their economy. They want their citizens to be able to work in other countries and invite investments. They want to build BMWs in the Ukraine. They want all those things that Europe has that Russia economically, politically can't offer them. So there's this been bulging divide between the Ukraine and Russia. And Russia's end goal is to make them quit that. Like literally bring them, if they have to drag them by force, they are going to go for the Ukraine and bring them back into the fold. So that's Putin's ultimate vision, is a united Ukraine and Russia, if that makes sense.
It sounds like Ukraine got a taste of freedom, or freedom for want of a better word, for those 30 years and said, this is pretty great. Like, can we keep doing this? We don't want to go back to the way things were. This is so much better. And it's like the stepdad coming home from work and he's like, oh, no, game's over.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And to Russia, the consequences of having this breakaway with the Ukraine, if they let Ukraine go, they already see it, because that happened with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. 3 former Soviet bloc countries, Soviet republics, have made that clean break. And they're in the European Union, their economies are growing, and they have joined NATO. So there are now like American forces and NATO forces operating in countries that border Russia. So Russia does not want any more of that to happen. So if they can, plug that leak, like stop these countries from going the way of Europe, going the way of NATO, they're going to do it. So that's one of the biggest drivers for what's the conflict that's brewing in the Ukraine. That's kind of what set this whole thing off in 2014. Another piece to it is Russia doesn't want to combine the Ukraine and Russia into one country per se. There's actually logic and strength to having 2 separate nations have the same end goals. So countries like Kazakhstan, there was just an uprising in Kazakhstan and Russia sent troops to Kazakhstan to put it down. Russia ideally would want all of those former Soviet bloc republics to be independent countries, but politically basically be puppet states of Russia and be under Putin. Like if they can form a European Union type system in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, that's what they would want. They would want to combine all those countries kind of to create a counterweight to the European Union and a counterweight that economically and a counterweight militarily to NATO. So it doesn't make sense for them to just like create one bigger Russia. It's way more important for them to have 15, 16, 18 different countries, with their own votes in the United Nations and their own voices on the international stage, but all supporting Russia's vision. So that's what Putin ideally wants, is to create this like Russo bloc system. But Ukraine's kind of been throwing a monkey wrench into those plans by overthrowing their pro-Putin president back in 2014, and because he voted against unionization or Europeanization of the Ukraine and to protect Putin's vision, and the Ukrainian people revolted. They revolted and threw him out, and that led Russia to invade the Crimea and start a civil war in the Ukraine in 2014, which hasn't ended and keeps going, and potentially we can see more formal Russian military involvement inside the borders of the Ukraine in potentially within the next few weeks. So
yeah, and that kind of brings us up to what's currently happening. So we had the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. Since that push, there has still been military or Russian-backed military and Russian-backed civil unrest happening on that eastern side of Ukraine. So there's been scuffles, there's been this kind of internal civil war going on, even though we call it the Russian-Ukraine war since 2014, but it's just been kind of going back and forth. And now with the introduction of Biden and really the push from the West of, look, Russia, you need to stop. You need to back off your 100,000 troops that you just amassed on the Ukrainian-Russian border.
Can we have a moment for that? 100,000 troops on the border.
That's a lot of people.
Currently, and they're building more. So U.S. intelligence estimates put the number that they think if an invasion were to happen, we're looking at up to 170,000 regular Russian forces, and I don't know how many other paramilitary forces and security forces they would bring into the fold if they're not already operating inside of the Ukraine in preparation for a potential invasion of that country. So we're looking at 170,000 forces invading the Ukraine.
Right, and that's what I was going to say, is that's just counting the ones that they're amassing on the border. That doesn't count anyone that they already have within the borders of Ukraine that have been fueling this fire, this civil unrest. So I guess the question now, since we have the U.S. and Russia in talks, we have Ukraine and the U.S. in talks as to what they're wanting, what they're willing to kind of compromise on, which doesn't look like any of the three sides are really willing to compromise on anything. Plus, we have NATO and the EU brought into this because of the demands that Russia has made as far as you can't do anything. We want you to withdraw all military actions from within this set parameter of our borders. We want you to not allow Ukraine to join NATO or join the EU. So with these talks, do we think that given Russia's history and given Putin's own history of saying one thing, doing another, or saying, like he is now, 15 different things, and we don't know which way he's going to go, do we think diplomacy with Russia is even a viable option? Or are we just wasting time?
It's difficult to say. I don't necessarily think that diplomacy is what's going to stop Putin from not invading. If Putin chooses not to invade the Ukraine, I don't think it is going to be a result of anything that comes out of negotiations, which just the most recent ones, like the ones that ended yesterday, happened in Vienna. The Office of Security Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE talks. So again, nothing was decided. No sides gave any concessions, and no agreements were actually met. They kind of just restated their positions.
It's all been posturing.
I don't think it's all been posturing, exactly. And separately, the talks that just concluded yesterday, the formal write-up from the State Department by the Biden administration is going to go to Putin formally in paper writing. So he's waiting to review that before he quote unquote makes a decision. But like I had just said, I don't think diplomacy is what's going to kind of change Putin's mind on the situation. He's weighing several different things, one of which I think most important of what Putin is going to do is, can he spin this enough in Russia to maintain legitimacy as president? Like, can he get enough of the Russian population on board with a war to invade the Ukraine? If he can do that, then the likelihood he's going to invade significantly higher. So that I think is probably the biggest thing he's going to weigh. And then secondarily, whatever consequences he thinks he will incur from the invasion. Can he and Russia ride out the storm of whatever economic sanctions will follow, or whatever other military response will actually follow if he chooses to invade? And again, if he can survive those two, I think the likelihood he's going to invade significantly higher. So I don't think I think diplomacy is just for show right now. I think it's really just kind of a calculus in Putin's mind of, can he get away with it? Like, if this is something if he can win this score, then yeah, I believe personally then he will invade. So
I have a question about...
Also, going back to what I had just said earlier, apologize.
Sure.
The things that they're negotiating about with this invasion or potential invasion aren't even, like, they're talking out of two sides of their mouth. Putin and Russia, like I had mentioned, their end goal is to create this like unified counterweight to Western Europe, and that's not being discussed at all. And if he allows the Ukraine to go the way of Europe, then he loses out on his goals. So that's not being negotiated or talked about whatsoever right now. They're talking about missile defense concessions and NATO-led military exercises close to the Russian border. Like, those are the things that are being discussed as the reasons for why Putin might invade the Ukraine, when in fact that is nothing. That's nothing at all of why they're even amassing forces on the border.
Yeah, my question is that I'm thinking about and this is a scary thought, but like, what's happening in Putin's mind? Like, what his key motivation? Because you mentioned how he has to maintain legitimacy, because a failure on the international stage for him would be a devastation. If he lost Ukraine, if Ukraine went the way of Lithuania and Latvia and these other countries that used to be part of the Soviet bloc but are no longer, that would not be good for him. Is this a matter of him wanting to maintain a certain appearance to the Russian people? How much of the Russian people's vote or care or concern does he care about? Is this about keeping the Russian people happy and satisfying their goals, or is this really just, no, these are just his goals and it's really just what he wants, and he couldn't really care less what the Russian people want?
I guess what I'm hearing Zach ask is would Putin be in a mind frame of being concerned of going the same way as Gorbachev, or going the same way as the monarchy with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, where the people see failure on your part, uprise, and you're ousted?
I don't think that is necessarily a concern of Putin. I do believe in his mind, he's acting out the will of the Russian people. He thinks that he knows best for what Russia needs and what the Russian people needs, which is a strong Russia and a unified Russia, and a Russia that can influence its neighbors, and a Russia that is kind of a center of power that he imagined Russia was at some time. And I would argue, I don't think Russia's ever been relevant in world history. I'm just going to say that. Yes, there was a 70-year period where they were the Soviet Union, and everything America was concerned about was like the Cold War and East-West relations. So, and that's the world that Putin was raised up in and Putin served in as an intelligence officer. And funny enough, he was actually stationed in Dresden, Germany on November 9th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell.
Came down.
And
yep.
yeah.
Hashtag mind blown.
Yeah. He saw that firsthand, and he doesn't want his fear, if he fears anything whatsoever, is more of that to happen not just with Russia's neighbors, but also within Russia internally. He worries about a cannibalization of Russia by outside forces, both Western forces like Europe and the United States, but also with China. Like, China's massively developed in military and is the center of power in Asia. And granted, they're a very large country and they have over 1 billion people in their population. But that is still a strategic fear, is that he won't be able to maintain influence and power in the Pacific or in Asia, just like he won't be able to maintain power and influence on his western border and with Europe. So to answer your question, he does, in his mind, think he is acting out the will of the people to kind of put on the strongman front and also kind of propel Russia into this future that he wants, which is a strong Russia, and he is the people's champion, and he thinks this is what the people want, that they want to bring back some kind of like non-existent glory days. He wants to make Russia great again, and I'm just gonna say it, Russia's never been great. Russia's actually never been great. It's always had problems. It was always conflicted. It had serfdom till the mid-1800s. Then it had a communist revolution. It was invaded by the Nazis, and they lost 20 million in that war. They had famines in the Ukraine because of the communist policies. There's been so much turmoil in Russia. A lot of it had nothing to do with the rest of the world. It was all kind of internally driven. They did it to themselves, minus the invasion by the Nazis. But in then some ways you could blame that on Russia too, because Stalin made a non-aggression pact with Hitler and helped him invade Poland. That's something no one ever talks about, is that Russia was complicit in the invasion of Poland by the Nazi regime. They invaded from the other border.
You had kind of the access there. You had Stalin, Mussolini, and Hitler all together that were making those those pacts amongst each other. And it was kind of like, okay, well, as long as you stay in your area, then we might help you. But even if we don't help you, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to kind of let you do what you do.
Yeah, even taken a step further, something like 3,000 Polish military officers were executed by the Soviet Union after the Nazi invasion of Poland. I forgot where that happened, the exact town, but there's a marker to commemorate it, the fact that these Polish officers were killed at Russian hands, not Nazi hands. So it was the Russians that did it, complicitly did it, and aided, the Nazi war machine and the genocide that happened in Poland. So yeah, Russia. Can you say they were responsible for what happened to them? Yeah, they should have known not to trust Hitler, and they aided and abetted his efforts in Eastern Europe right before Hitler turned on them. Who didn't see that one coming? So yeah, all of this. So Russia's never been great, but in Putin's mind, there was this magical time where Russia was great, and he wants to make Russia great again.
You stole it from my lips. I was just about to say it. He wants to make Russia great again.
Yeah. I mean, it's all about, they do the May Day parades to commemorate the end of World War II. They still do it every single year. They put on these giant parades. It's all about pageantry to show, hey, look how strong we are. Look how beautiful we are as a country. Look at this pride that we have. So it's very similar, obviously, to what Hitler did with Germany in terms of kind of instilling this nationalist pride within the peoples. So that's something we haven't talked about, is the fervent nationalist sentiments that exist in Russia. Russians, your average Russian, yeah, he doesn't care much about politics, but your average Russian is still a fervent nationalist. So, and that's a lot of the things that Putin's able to do, is because he gets this legitimacy for his actions based on the mindset of your average Russian citizen is like, yeah, this is for the good of Russia. Like, of course we need a strong military. Of course we need to beat down these insurgents in Chechnya. And of course we need to fight back against the West that wants to take everything from us again, and throw us in the dark ages once again. So yeah.
So to sort of close this bit here, if you could,
Because we could go on forever on this.
hours.
Oh yeah,
Hours.
We could talk about the gay oppression in Russia. We could talk about what he's done with the church. We could talk
gosh.
about his nationalist groups that he has that are basically like bounty hunters against like religious minorities, sexual minorities, you name it. Everyone in Russia is a target, or is a potential
Journalist.
target. Journalists, yeah, 100%. Something like 20-something officially journalists have been killed under Putin, like by Putin directly, like he's ordered their executions. Some estimates put that number up to close to 200 actual journalists. So again, there's another check and balance system that doesn't exist in Russia. There's no free media. Everything, is controlled by the Russian state and at the will of Putin, essentially.
Now let's say you could put on your, like, I don't know, your old fortune teller outfit, and you were Maria Ospinskaya for a hot minute, living in some like shtetl in Odessa, and you could tell the future, looking into your crystal ball. What do you see as the potential future outcomes here? I mean, what are the chances of Russia taking some of these more bold steps, like invading Ukraine, or invading any other country, or maybe even partnering possibly with other countries such as China, their neighbor? What do you foresee as possible outcomes here?
Sure. I think in the interim, I believe Russia will commit Russian forces into eastern Ukraine. So I don't believe that Russia will actually invade to try to conquer all of the Ukraine initially in one go. I do believe, though, that they will commit a lot of forces to occupy whole swaths of eastern Ukraine that have large Russian-speaking populations and ethnically Russian peoples that live there. And they will occupy those territories and spin it as, oh, they're the liberators of these Russian peoples, and they're there just to protect them from the aggression of the fascist Ukrainians that want to subjugate these Russian peoples. I believe we will all see that military outcome, and following that, there's going to be a massive counterinsurgency that's going to be supported by NATO and other Eastern Bloc countries that hate Russia, and additional sanctions put on Russia to make it essentially a pariah state. How effective any of that will be to get Russia to pull back or change course, I think time will tell. I don't think it will actually be that effective, especially considering how quickly presidents change in the United States. If Trump is elected in 2024, Putin's his buddy. So he's probably not going to want to commit additional American support and forces to help prop up the Ukraine to fight against Putin, if that's the case.
It's interesting. You mentioned something about ethnically Russian. I've never really thought about it this way, but how much does race or racism, how much does that play a role in his decision making?
A great amount. So Russia, just kind of moving away from the Ukraine for a second, Russia's a very racist country. I know we talk about how the United States is racist, and yes, I 100% agree. Russia is extremely racist, and that comes back to this kind of nationalist identity. That's like, what does it mean to be Russian? And weirdly, it sounds a lot like, what does it mean to be, an Aryan? So this idea of like this Russian is big, brawny, blonde hair, blue-eyed, kind of like pale-skinned man, and then the counterpart of the female, tall, beautiful features, luscious curves like that, and blonde hair, blue-eyed. That is your Russian, like you're not stereotypical, but your idealized idea of what an ethnically Russian person looks like. And so race plays a huge part of it. So countries that speak Russian or a Slavic language that have peoples that look like that, Russia thinks like, those are our people, those are Russians. And we've seen Russia get involved in countries that have nothing to do with Russia, but they are protecting Russian peoples. Going back to World War One, Russia got involved in World War One because of the Serbs, because of what was happening in Serbia, and same thing in the Yugoslavian conflicts in Kosovo. They stepped in to protect the Serbian people because they're Eastern Orthodox Christian, they're Slavic speaking, and they look like Russians. So that's another way that Russia can justify what they are doing in the Ukraine, is say these are our people. We are protecting these people, because they are, in Putin's mind, especially in the Ukraine, these are Russians. He doesn't see them as Ukrainians. He sees them as like other Russians.
Goodness, it's so sordid. It's so just. There's so many layers that we don't realize being here in the States until you really do that deep dive. And I know that I speak for both Zach and I when I say thank you so much, because we could not have dissected and peeled back the layers on this onion without you joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate
Such
being
a
here.
treat. Yeah. And definitely, if you are game for a round two to kind of dive more into the ethnocentric side of the Russian enterprise and talk about the nationalism, because I know there's a huge movement that's been going on for the last 10, 12 years of developing this neo-Nazi-esque Russian youth army, and really how they are indoctrinating. Yes, how they're indoctrinating them into nationalism. But we'll have to save that for another time. But for now, I think we're going to move on to our next segment.
It's my favorite segment.
Our favorite segment of the podcast in general, because of course guests are always our favorite.
That's number one. This is number two.
Yeah, this is going to be number two this week. But we're going to go to I Don't Know Her. It's a segment where we highlight a queer person in history you should know. So, Zach, who are we going to learn about this week?
Today we're going to learn about Rachel Levine.
I don't know her.
Well, girl, let me tell you all about her. Rachel Levine is a trans woman who serves as the Assistant Secretary of Health for DHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. She was nominated by President Biden and confirmed by the Senate just last year in 2021, making her the first openly trans person to be confirmed by the Senate. That's historic.
Go her.
And it doesn't stop there.
Representation.
It doesn't stop there. It gets better. It gets better. So we've probably heard of the uniformed services. That's your Army, your Navy, your Marines, your Air Force, etc. There's actually one I did not even know about. I didn't realize that the Public Health Service Commission Corps was also one of those uniformed services. So
I did not either.
I didn't either. So on
And
October
I'm a military
19th,
brat. I should know this.
how dare you? I bet Samantha knew.
Yeah, there's a few others that are kind of weird too.
NOAA, right, is also on?
Yes, NOAA is another one. So those are non-combatant uniformed services.
Yes.
So they don't carry guns, but they wear military uniforms. They have rank. They are commissioned officers, like I was.
In fact, on October 19th, 2021, Levine was commissioned as a 4-star admiral in the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, becoming the first openly transgender 4-star officer in United States Uniformed Services. And she's also the first female 4-star admiral. The first female 4-star admiral. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Secretary Admiral Dr. Rachel Levine. I don't know which of those titles is supposed to come in what order. You know, like when you're a doctor and a reverend, you're Reverend Doctor, not
Right,
Doctor Reverend. Yeah. I don't know if it's Secretary Admiral Doctor, Doctor Admiral Secretary. I don't know how that works. But Rachel Levine, everyone. And that is a queer person in history to date happening right now that we think you should know.
Yes, sir. Oh my gosh. Talk about representation. The 2021 has just been a year, hasn't it? we have our first female vice president, and now we have our first trans female 4-star admiral. I mean, just
it's amazing.
Diversity, people.
Let's keep it coming.
Let's keep it coming. All right. Well, that does it for us here on the podcast this week. Thank you for listening. Samantha, where can people find you online?
I'm pretty active on Instagram. So my Insta is at Sebrida. That's actually my middle name. So Sebrida. So find me on Insta, message me. We can talk politics. We can talk geopolitics, economics. But mostly I just post selfies and travel photos. So pretty basic.
The good stuff.
And my cat.
And your cat. Always have to have the fur babies on there. Always.
Absolutely.
Well, make sure to follow us on social media. I'm Mason, and you can find me at Real Mason Dixon.
And you can find me at ZacharyPenn48.
You can also email us at withagaytwist@gmail.com. And again, thank you, Samantha, for joining us this week. It was a privilege and an honor to have you on our podcast. Can't wait to do it again. Your insights were just delicious.
Oh, I really appreciate it. No, thank you for having me.
We have to educate the children, honey. And then for all of you out there listening, make sure you give us a rating on your favorite podcast app so other fabulous queens such as yourself can find us. And remember, being queer is political. Later.
Bye, girl.